It is Labor Day weekend, 1934. Thousands of people are gathered on the boardwalk of Asbury Park, New Jersey, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. What they are watching is not a fireworks display. It is a ship on fire drifting out of the darkness toward the shore, still carrying the dead. 137 people lost their lives that night. The captain had already been dead for hours before the first flame appeared. The cause of the fire was never officially determined, and the records that might tell us the truth are, in part, still classified by the United States government. This is the story of the SS Morro Castle. The Morro Castle did not happen in isolation. The world that built her made her possible. It is 1930. The United States is in the early grip of the Great Depression. Banks have collapsed. Unemployment is climbing. The decade of prosperity that Americans had come to expect after the First World War has evaporated almost overnight. For the vast majority of people, life has become a matter of survival rather than enjoyment. The future is uncertain, and escape, in whatever form it can be found, has become something close to a necessity. Into this moment steps the Ward Line. The New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company, to give it its full name, has been running ships between New York and Havana since the middle of the previous century. It is a company built on cargo and mail, and passenger travel has always been secondary to the freight it carries and the lucrative government contract it holds to move mail between the two countries. But by the late 1920s, the Ward Line has seen an opportunity. The United States government has made available a construction fund for American shipping companies to modernize their fleets, and the Ward Line moves quickly. It commissions 2 new ships at the Newport News shipbuilding yard in Virginia. One will be named the Oriente, after a province in Cuba. The other will be named the Morro Castle, after the ancient stone fortress and lighthouse that stands at the entrance to Havana Bay, watching every ship that passes through. The Morro Castle is christened in the spring of 1930. She is a beautiful thing, 508 feet long, just over 11,000 gross tons, powered by twin turbo-electric engines, capable of crossing more than 1,100 miles of open Atlantic in under 60 hours. She can carry nearly 500 passengers and a crew of 240. Her interiors are finished in the style of a luxury hotel. The main dining room stretches across 2 decks and seats hundreds of people at once. The first-class lounge has wood-paneled walls with mother-of-pearl inlays and Corinthian columns. There is a fireplace. There is a piano. There is air conditioning, which in 1930 is still considered a modern marvel. She is, by every measure, one of the most impressive ships on the American coastline. And she is popular for one reason, that the Ward Line's advertising materials do not advertise directly. The United States is living under prohibition. Alcohol is banned. But the moment a ship crosses the 3-mile territorial limit into international waters, the law no longer applies. Passengers aboard the Morro Castle can drink legally the moment they leave New York Harbor. By the time the ship reaches Havana, many of them have not stopped. The Morro Castle is, in the language of the era, a floating party. A legal escape from a dry, exhausted country. A round trip costs $65, which includes meals and 2 nights in Havana. For a country where that amount of money is not nothing, it is still astonishingly affordable. People come from across the eastern seaboard. Businessmen, tourists, newlyweds, retirees, young people in their 20s looking for a week away from the breadlines and the newspapers. For the duration of the crossing, the depression does not exist. Havana itself adds another layer of allure. The Cuban capital in the early 1930s is one of the most exciting cities in the Western Hemisphere. Its nightlife is legendary. Its rum is cheap. Its casinos are open and generous. American tourists who cannot legally drink at home arrive in Havana and find a world that caters to every appetite they have been denied. They spend 2 days there and then board the Morro Castle for the journey home, tired and satisfied, ready to face whatever America has waiting for them. Beneath this glamour, however, the ship carries a more complicated reality. The Ward Line's routes to Cuba run through waters that are, by the early 1930s, politically charged. Cuba is in upheaval. Fulgencio Batista has seized power in a coup the previous year. Exiles, nationalists, government agents, and people fleeing persecution in both directions regularly travel the same route. Protesters had met the Morro Castle in port on more than one occasion. Rumors circulate on the New York waterfront about what the ship carries beyond its declared cargo. Longshoremen talk about guns moving south. Crew members allegedly smuggle narcotics north. The Ward Line's relationship with the United States government is close, financially dependent, and, according to some accounts, complicated by interests that go well beyond mail delivery. The crew itself is a problem that nobody in management wants to fully address. The Morro Castle sails routinely short-handed because jobs are scarce and the Ward Line pays poorly. The workers who do sign on face long hours, poor conditions, and a captain who has made it clear he has little interest in their complaints. Language barriers create friction between different national groups among the staff. Labor organizers have made attempts to reach the crew, and the ward line has watched those attempts with hostility. Among the crew is a chief radio operator named George White Rogers. He is pale and physically soft, does not look like a seaman, keeps almost entirely to himself. Colleagues describe a persistent unease around him without being able to name exactly why. The captain himself has expressed private discomfort in his presence. Rogers has no friends aboard. He is, in the language people use when they cannot explain something, simply odd. Captain Robert Wilmot has been at the helm of the Morro Castle since her maiden voyage. He is an experienced sailor who has made the crossing to Havana and back 174 times. He knows this ship better than anyone. But Wilmot's priorities have always skewed toward appearances rather than procedure. He does not want passengers inconvenienced. Fire drills, when they happen at all, involve only the crew. Passengers are not required to attend because Wilmot does not want to disturb their holiday. The ship's fire detection system, one of the most advanced available at the time, has been switched off for the voyage home because animal hides loaded in Havana give off fumes that might trigger the alarms and startle the guests. The lifeboats sit in their davits untested, their chains and mechanisms layered over with the same oil-based paint that Wilmot orders applied to the hull and superstructure every time the ship is in port. He wants his ship to look immaculate. He does not spend much time thinking about what will happen if something goes wrong. By the summer of 1934, the Morro Castle has made over 100 crossings without serious incident. She has passed every safety inspection. The ward line's advertising still proudly states that in 50 years of operation, the company has never lost a passenger. She is, officially, one of the safest ships on the water. What she actually is, below that polished surface, is a ship waiting for the one circumstance in which everything will fail at once. The final voyage of the Morro Castle begins in Havana on the 5th of September, 1934. It is the last crossing of the summer season. The ship carries 318 passengers and a crew of 231. None of them know that Captain Wilmot, their experienced and authoritative commanding officer, has arrived at Havana in a state of fear. What Wilmot has shared with his officers during the Havana stopover is something that no one will fully understand until much later. He believes that someone on his ship intends to kill him. He has said this plainly, though not loudly. He does not name who he suspects. He does not give details. He simply tells his senior officers that he is afraid something is going to happen, and then he says nothing more about it. His officers are uncertain how to interpret this. The captain has always been attentive to his own image, even somewhat theatrical. Some of them assume he is being dramatic. Others are not so sure. On the afternoon of the 6th, as the ship moves north along the southeastern coast of the United States, the weather begins to change. Clouds build on the horizon. The wind picks up. By the morning of the 7th, the sea has turned rough, and the winds have shifted to the northeast, the first clear sign of a developing nor'easter. The passengers who have spent the week dancing, drinking, and exploring Havana are now quiet. Many retire to their cabins early. The ship takes on a subdued quality. Rain comes in bursts. The decks are empty. That evening, Captain Wilmot requests that dinner be brought to his quarters. He does not want to eat in the dining room. He complains of stomach trouble. His officers note this but do not yet treat it as cause for alarm. A few hours later, a knock at his cabin door goes unanswered. The ship's doctor is called. He enters the cabin and finds Wilmot dead. The official determination is a heart attack, possibly precipitated by severe gastric distress. The time of death is recorded as approximately 7:45 in the evening. The ship's doctor sends a telegram to the ward line offices in New York. Captain Wilmot is dead. Command passes to Chief Officer William Worms. Worms is eating dinner with his fiancée when the news reaches him. He is a competent officer, experienced enough to navigate and manage a vessel at sea. But he has never commanded a ship in his own right. He takes the bridge in the middle of a storm, with a crew that is already unsettled, and he knows almost immediately that this situation is unlike anything he has prepared for. The ship is still moving north. The wind is now above 30 miles per hour. The passengers below are asleep and unaware that anything has changed. There is also the matter of Wilmot's body, which is meant to be delivered to New York for examination. Maritime protocol and common sense both suggest that a captain who dies suddenly at sea, a man who expressed fear for his own life just days before his death, should be examined by a medical examiner on arrival. The body is placed in the ship's care. It will never reach New York. It will simply disappear. No autopsy will ever be performed. The exact cause of Robert Wilmot's death will never be established. By midnight on September 7th, the Morro Castle is 8 miles off the New Jersey coast, pushing through a nor'easter with an inexperienced acting captain, a crew that has been working short-handed all season, and 500 people sleeping below in their staterooms. Nobody on that ship has any idea what is about to begin. At 12 minutes to 3 in the morning, in a storage locker inside the first-class writing room on B deck, someone or something ignites a fire. The locker is small. It contains paper, ink bottles, cleaning fluids, and chemically treated blankets. It is the kind of space that, under normal circumstances, would hold a small fire long enough for it to be discovered and extinguished. But the Morro Castle is not operating under normal circumstances. The ventilation system that moves air through the ship is designed for passenger comfort. In a structure full of wood paneling, lacquered surfaces, and layers of oil-based paint, that same ventilation system acts like a set of bellows. The fire does not stay small. Within minutes, it has moved beyond the locker. The first crew member to smell smoke sends word to the bridge. Worms is informed. The fire is confirmed. And here, within the first critical minutes, the response begins to fracture. The crew has never conducted a full fire drill with the passengers present. Many of them have never practiced the specific procedures for this situation. Some of them have been hired seasonally, without extensive training, and have never dealt with a shipboard emergency of any kind. There is no coordinated response. Different groups of crew members begin attempting to fight the fire independently, without knowing what others are doing, without a clear chain of command, and without adequate equipment. The ship's fire hydrants are among the first things to fail. The system installed on the Morro Castle has 42 hydrants, but it has been engineered on the assumption that no more than 6 will ever be used simultaneously. When crew members open every hydrant they can reach, the water pressure drops immediately to levels that make the hoses almost useless. The fire, unchecked, climbs through the ship's interior with speed that shocks everyone who witnesses it. In the first minutes after the alarm is raised, Acting Captain Worms makes a decision that historians and maritime experts will analyze for decades. Rather than turning the ship out of the wind or cutting speed, he maintains course and keeps the engines at full power, pushing directly into the nor'easter. What he intends, perhaps, is to make for shore as quickly as possible. What he achieves is something else entirely. With the bow pointed into a 30-knot gale, the Morro Castle becomes a wind tunnel. Air is forced through every corridor, every companionway, every gap in the paneling. The fire accelerates from a locker fire into a ship-wide catastrophe in under 15 minutes. It tears through the lounges, the staterooms, and the corridors faster than anyone can run ahead of it. The fire doors, which should contain the spread, are present but have been installed in frames surrounded by flammable wooden trim. The fire burns through the wood around each door before the door itself has any chance to do its job. Within 20 minutes, the main electrical cables burn through completely. The lights go out across the entire ship. The engines lose power. The steering fails. The Morro Castle goes dark and begins to drift. No longer a vessel anyone is controlling, just a burning hull moving with the current and the wind. On the boat deck, crew members attempt to lower the lifeboats. The ship carries 12. 6 are launched. The davits and chains that operate them are seized with layers of paint that Wilmot ordered applied on every layover, year after year. Some mechanisms refuse to move. Some lifeboats hang suspended, unable to reach the water. Of the 6 that do launch, the majority carry crew members, passengers, disoriented in the dark, breathing smoke, pressing against the railings of a ship whose deck plates are heating beneath their feet, find themselves with nowhere to go. There is a protocol governing emergency radio transmissions on merchant ships. The wireless operators cannot send a distress signal without explicit authorization from the captain. Worms, overwhelmed on the bridge and uncertain of his authority, does not give that authorization for over 30 minutes after the fire is confirmed. The ship's chief radio operator, George White Rogers, has been at his station since the alarm was raised. His assistant has already gone to the bridge twice, found chaos, and returned without instructions. Rogers has the technical capacity to send a distress call immediately. He waits. The single SOS finally transmitted at 23 minutes past 3 in the morning is the only one that reaches the outside world before the heat distorts the antenna and silences the radio completely. The passengers who are still alive at this point face 3 choices. They can stay on the burning ship, they can try to reach a lifeboat, or they can jump. Many jump. The life preservers stored aboard the Morro Castle are the old hard cork variety, and most passengers have never been shown how to wear them correctly. Those who put them on wrong and jump from the upper decks hit the ocean surface with the rigid cork at an angle that breaks necks and collarbones. The swells are running at 10 feet. The water temperature is cold enough to incapacitate an exhausted swimmer within minutes. Bodies begin to appear in the water around the drifting ship. Some passengers hold on. A young woman named Alice Desvernine wakes up to the glow of fire reflected through her porthole, stays calm enough to check on her aunt and cousin in the next cabin, and gets all 3 of them to the stern rail, where they wait for hours in the smoke and heat, refusing to jump until a rescue vessel finally reaches them. A young seaman helps passengers over the railing one by one for as long as he can. A cook from the galley hands out cork rings and deck chairs to people in the water. These moments of human determination run alongside the institutional collapse like two contradictory truths that cannot be separated from each other. By dawn, the Morro castle is completely abandoned. The fire has consumed the interior. The hull drifts north along the New Jersey coastline, still burning, trailing smoke across a heavy gray sky. By late afternoon on the 8th of September, the Morro castle has run aground 200 feet off the boardwalk of Asbury Park, New Jersey. She comes to rest directly in front of Convention Hall, the grand resort building that anchors the town's waterfront. The summer season should have ended days ago. Instead, within hours of the ship grounding, thousands of people are arriving from across the region to see her. The contrast is almost impossible to describe. The bodies of men, women, and children are still washing ashore along miles of New Jersey coastline. Rescue boats are still pulling survivors from the water. First responders are still carrying the injured up the beach. And on the Asbury Park boardwalk, vendors have already set up stands selling souvenir postcards. A 25-cent admission fee is being collected to view the wreck from the beach. In a single day, that collection brings in nearly $3,000. Hotels that expected to close remain full through the autumn. The town, which had been quietly declining for years, experiences an economic revival driven entirely by the presence of a still smoldering catastrophe just offshore. More than 100,000 people come to see her on some days. They walk to the end of the Convention Hall pier and look out at the charred hull. Some wade into the water and touch it. The wreck sits there for 6 months, slowly cooling, its black skeleton visible from the boardwalk, until March of the following year when it is finally towed away for scrap. The rescue effort in the hours after the fire is a story of improvised heroism and institutional failure in equal measure. The liner Monarch of Bermuda, which picked up the distress signal, arrives at the scene and pulls hundreds of survivors from the water. The city of Savannah does the same. Fishing boats, private vessels, and small coastal craft all contribute. The United States Coast Guard cutter Tampa is present in the area during the disaster. Its radio logs from that morning have been a subject of controversy ever since, with questions raised about why it did not intervene more decisively or prevent the ship from grounding. No official explanation satisfactory to all parties has ever been given. Of the roughly 550 people who were aboard, 137 do not survive. 17 of the dead are never identified. Their names, and in some cases their presence on the ship at all, remain unknown to this day, because no one knows with certainty who was on that final voyage. The formal investigation produces indictments against Acting Captain Worms, Chief Engineer Eban Abbott, and the Ward Line's Vice President Henry Cabot. All three are convicted of willful negligence and sent to prison. The convictions of Worms and Abbott are later overturned on appeal, the court ruling that a significant portion of the blame belongs to Captain Wilmot, who is dead and cannot be prosecuted. One figure emerges from the disaster not as a defendant but as a hero. George White Rogers is praised widely for staying at his post until the last possible moment, for sending the distress signal despite the paralysis on the bridge, and for remaining aboard until the final passengers had been evacuated. A wealthy passenger credits him with helping save her life. He becomes briefly a celebrity. He gives interviews. He takes his story on a vaudeville tour. The press calls him the hero of the Morro Castle. Nobody thinks to run a background check until it is already too late to matter. The radio operators on Ward Line ships were not employees of the Ward Line. They were placed on the vessels by the government. That placement had come without any serious investigation into who George White Rogers actually was. When investigators finally look, what they find rewrites everything. What they find is this: Rogers has a criminal record stretching back years before the Morro Castle. Convictions for theft and fraud, an investigation into a suspicious fire at a New York electrical company where he worked, never conclusively resolved. Repeated psychiatric treatment for a condition documented in his medical records as antisocial personality disorder. And a particular skill, noted in those records, that distinguishes him even from other people with a documented history of starting fires. He builds incendiary devices. Not improvised ones. Precisely engineered, timed, leaving no physical trace of ignition. Nobody checked. The question of what Rogers did or did not do on the night of September 7th and 8th sits at the center of the Morro Castle mystery, and it cannot be answered with certainty. But the circumstantial evidence is substantial, and it accumulates over years in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Rogers is one of the last people to see Captain Wilmot alive on the evening of his death. He visits the captain's quarters earlier in the day on a pretext involving another crew member. He is the only person present at both events, the death and the fire, who had a documented prior history of arson and an established capacity to build devices that start fires remotely and on a delay. His behavior throughout the night of the fire is described by witnesses as unusually calm. While passengers jump and crew members panic, Rogers sits at his radio equipment and waits. He sends the SOS only after the situation has become severe enough to be irreversible. When asked later why he waited so long, he says he could not act without the captain's authorization. The captain, by that point, has been dead for several hours. After the disaster, Rogers leaves the ward line and opens a radio repair shop in Bayonne, New Jersey. The shop catches fire and burns. Investigators look at it as a possible arson. They cannot prove it. Rogers is hired by the Bayonne Police Department as a radio technician. His supervisor is a lieutenant named Vincent Doyle, who develops a growing suspicion about his new employee. Rogers, it turns out, likes to talk about the Morro castle. He finds the subject fascinating. He is particularly fascinated by the question of how the fire might have been started, and he has a specific theory. He describes a device, a pen, in effect engineered with two internal chambers. One chamber contains acid, the other contains an explosive compound. The two are separated by a thin copper plate. The acid eats slowly through the plate. When the plate gives way, the two substances meet. The result is fire, precisely timed with no physical trace of ignition left behind. It is a meticulous description. Doyle asks Rogers directly whether that is how the Morro Castle fire was set. Rogers smiles and does not answer. In 1938, Rogers constructs exactly such a device and plants it in Doyle's space. The explosion cripples Doyle. Rogers is convicted of attempted murder and sent to prison. He is eventually released. He finds work at a plant in Jersey City, is fired under suspicion of theft, moves to another employer in Brooklyn, where co-workers become ill under circumstances that are never officially explained. He opens a second radio shop in Bayonne and strikes up a friendship with an elderly neighbor named William Hummel and Hummel's daughter. When Hummel decides to sell his home and move to Florida in the summer of 1953, the financial arrangement between the two men becomes a source of pressure. On the 1st of July that year, a tip leads police to check on the Hummels. They find both of them beaten to death. Rogers is arrested, tried, and convicted of double murder. He is sentenced to life imprisonment. He dies in prison in January of 1958 from a brain hemorrhage. He never confesses to the Morro Castle fire. He dies maintaining his innocence regarding that specific event, even as he is serving a life sentence for killing two people with his bare hands. Vincent Doyle, his crippled former supervisor, spends the rest of his life attempting to prove that Rogers started the fire on the Morro Castle. He never fully succeeds. The physical evidence is gone. The fire consumed it. The question of government knowledge and government silence hangs over the entire case in a way that historians have still not resolved. The FBI, it is now known, had Rogers under active suspicion as a potential arsonist within 6 days of the disaster. An extensive investigation was conducted. The summary finding, made available years later, concludes that arson could not be proven because nothing definitive was established at the formal hearings. But when researchers used the Freedom of Information Act in 1999 to access the federal files on George White Rogers, they found significant portions of those files either heavily redacted or simply missing. Documents that should exist do not. Pages are blacked out. The government, nearly 7 decades after a passenger ship fire, continues to treat information about this case as sensitive. Why? There are theories, and some of them are better supported than others. The Ward Line ships were built substantially with federal money and operated under a federal mail contract that was financially critical to the company. Some researchers have made a compelling case that the Morro Castle was used, on at least some of its southbound voyages, to move arms and military equipment to Batista's government in Cuba. In quiet contradiction of official American policy, the ship's classified construction plans may have shown cargo compartments used for this purpose. Rogers himself, placed on the ship by the government without a background check, may have been known to federal agencies in some capacity beyond his official role. If he was an informant, or if his activities on the ship were in any way sanctioned or tolerated, the incentive to keep those files sealed would be enormous. What is certain is that the Ward Line went bankrupt within 2 years of the disaster. The company that had proudly stated it had never lost a passenger was gone. Wilmot's body was never recovered. The cause of his death was never established. The cause of the fire was never officially determined. The man most credibly implicated died in prison for other crimes without ever being tried for the one that defined his legacy. And yet the Morro Castle changed things in ways that are still felt today. The disaster exposed, with brutal clarity, the gap between the safety standards that existed on paper and the reality of what happened when a ship actually caught fire with passengers aboard. The reforms that followed were comprehensive and lasting. Ships built after the Morro Castle are required to use fire-retardant materials in their interiors rather than wood paneling and lacquered surfaces that feed a fire. Automatic fire doors are mandatory, installed in frames that will not burn. Ship-wide alarm systems are required to alert every passenger simultaneously. Emergency generators must be capable of maintaining power independently of the main electrical system. Crew members must be trained in firefighting procedures and required to participate in regular drills with passengers present, not separate from them. Life preserver fitting must be demonstrated to every passenger who boards. The standards for merchant marine officer licensing are overhauled entirely, leading directly to the establishment of the United States Merchant Marine Academy. Every ship that carries passengers today carries them under rules that were written because of what happened off the New Jersey coast in 1934. The changes are not named after the Morro Castle. They do not come with a plaque or a dedication. They are simply the baseline. What is expected? What is required? The invisible legacy of a disaster that most people have forgotten. 137 people died on a ship that had passed every inspection, built to the highest standards of its era, operated by a company with half a century of experience. They died because the fire detection system had been switched off, because the hydrant pressure was designed for a peaceful morning, not an emergency, because the lifeboats were painted shut, because nobody had ever made the passengers put on a life preserver and shown them how it worked, because a man who should never have been on that ship was at the center of everything, and the one institution with both the authority and the evidence to pursue him chose, for reasons that have never been fully explained, to look the other way. The Morro Castle burned, ran aground, became a tourist attraction, and was scrapped. The files were sealed. The hero turned murderer and died in prison. The captain's body was never found, and somewhere in the federal archives, behind pages that remain blacked out nearly 90 years later, the rest of the story is still waiting.